And Mr. Engineer, Mr. Mark, is going to work on seeing if he'll be able to bring a picture up. But what I handed out was a picture of Herod's temple, which is kind of an incorrect way of classifying this building. It's the second temple, but Herod, who was appointed what we might call a governor over Judea, is given credit for the architecture of the building because he really put his foot in it. American phrase, which meant he went all the way and made something quite extravagant, and it was seen as one of the most beautiful buildings in the known world at the time. And maybe we'll touch on that as we go along. So today, we're going to be looking at God's temple and how people may have interacted with this temple, with this space. And so first off, what I want to do is remove any misconceptions that more than likely we are carrying when it comes to how we perceive and see the temple of God, the temple that the Israelites and the Jews went to go worship at. One, recognize the first temple was built, and I'm not looking, and so I'm going off the top of my head. I don't even think that I made that a part of what I'm doing. By Solomon in 512 BCE. Remember, time is going backwards when we look at the time before Christ. And so as time moves from these later periods to our present, we're headed towards zero. And then after Christ, we're headed up, and we are now in the year 2025, which also is incorrect. The Jews have tried to keep a more accurate count of the years, and they are also incorrect, and they admit it. The Jews, I believe, are at 5,000 and... 78. Yes, 800 and something, or whatever it is they're at. They will openly admit that they're about 200 years off. And when you try to make adjustments for that, you hit 6,000 or above 6,000, which really scares people because man has been allowed 6,000 years to do his own thing, which means if some of those numbers were true, then, we're due for everything to go haywire and Christ to come back. It's kind of a unsafe, unprudent way to operate by saying, hey, 6,000 years are up, because many people have gotten into trouble doing things like that. That's not our purpose. Our purpose is to do the right thing so that when things do get set off, we're already as we should be, as opposed to just worrying and focusing on time and dates, because it's not for us to know. That being said, so Solomon's temple was built around then, and the temple lasted about, thinking it was 420 years before it was ransacked and burnt to the ground. Incidentally, the second temple lasted same literal exact amount, whatever that was. Maybe it was 420. And so after Solomon's temple, the people didn't act right. They were offering, they were paying attention to idols and corrupting the temple with their behavior, and oftentimes bringing some of their pagan influences into the temple. And at some point, God's temperament wore thin. The people were driven out the land, and the temple was destroyed. Later, a remnant of the people returned, and they rebuilt the temple, but this time far more modestly. And it didn't look anything as grand as Solomon's temple had. And for those that were in the audience when that temple was rededicated or dedicated again, they cried because it didn't look anything like what they remembered when they were kids. And there were but so many people that probably would have been in their 80s or so because they had been gone for 70 years. And then that very temple that got rebuilt last in operation all the way into the 1st century when our Bibles come into focus in the 1st century in Christ's day. So I mentioned our first order of business was to try to get rid of some of our misconceptions. One, to start, we look in Matthew chapter 16. Matthew 16, and in verse 18, we see Christ making a reference to the church. Matthew 16 and verse 18. As he's speaking to Peter, and I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. And right here, Christ is talking about a church. Yes. And that's what we think of when we come to quote unquote church. And oftentimes when we think of church and we think of the temple, it's almost interchangeable. Temple is church, church is a temple. So when we look at church, we may think of us getting here together, and we may think of singing songs, especially people of our culture. We think of praise and worship, because that's what you do at church. If anything, that's what church is, praise and worship. And it's something that you do inside a building. But lo and behold, church is not a building. Church, as it would be translated from the Greek and as it's translated into English, when Christ said he would build his church, the word was ecclesia. And ecclesia has nothing to do with the building. Ecclesia has nothing to do with praise and worship, but it refers to a gathering of people. So truly, church is the people. It's not the building. It's not the manicured lawns. It has nothing to do with that. But that's the way we would think. And so what we find, when we look about how Christ would detail what his efforts are in working with the church in Matthew chapter 13. In Matthew chapter 13 and in verse 15, he's speaking about the stubbornness of the people. And he says, for this people's heart, as he's quoting from Isaiah, for this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. That is the goal eventually. But we see what would happen if the people would actually listen. God would wind up healing them. It has nothing to do with what he would do with the building, how the building is going to get a new coat of paint, how they're going to put some nice shrubs in the front of the building, or maybe some lights to spotlight all the trees, make the building look nice. It has nothing to do with mahogany doors that they could put on the front of the building and have the building looking spiffy. God has made no comments about how he wants the various churches, in the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, the Baptist Church, the Methodist Church, the Episcopalian Church, or the Lutheran Church, and I could just keep going on and on. He doesn't care about how the building might look. And so, we see the focus when it comes to church is not about the building, but it's the people. We see David expressed an interest in the church. And I am guilty of my own point. He expressed an interest in building a temple and a house for God. I eventually am going to make a distinction between how we may switch these words out, temple and church. 2 Samuel chapter 7. 2 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 5. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 5. David expressed an interest in building a house for God. Because remember, the temple, or rather the ark, was enclosed in a tabernacle. The structure that was used for God's presence to dwell before the temple. And it was simply made up of a tent. So the Ark of the Covenant was essentially in a tent. And I guess David started to feel some kind of way as he was living in what to him at that time was a nice house. He's expressing as he thinks, I'm living in a house of cedar, and God is living in a tent, or the Ark of the Covenant, making the sense of, I'm living nice, and look at how we are treating God and things associated to God. And fast forward till today, if you lived in a house of cedar, it's like, you need to step up your game. So we may see things differently, but just recognize at the time, David saw himself as living better than how the tabernacle was enclosed. 2 Samuel chapter 7 and in verse 5, eventually Nathan brings a message to David in reference to David's interest in doing this. And God's response, God's attitude is, go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I haven't been staying in a house. Now all of a sudden, this is your interest? You want to build me a house? I've been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling, and I ain't had a problem with it. Continuing on, wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of the rulers from whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, why have you not built me a house of cedar? You're living in a house of cedar. Did I ever ask anybody to build me a house of cedar? And this is his point before he goes on to say how this might be done. God never showed any interest in having the house. That wasn't his thing. That wasn't his qualm. When we look at the Greek gods and the Roman gods, well, they get off on that. How dare you not build me a nice house? How dare you not come and worship me, recognize me, and pay me all of this adoration? That's how they got down. But not the God of the Bible. And so, in fact, what we find happening is this need for a place to worship, which is why you would want to build a temple, I would imagine, is not for God's benefit. It's for our benefit. The whole purpose of having a temple would be for our benefit. The purpose of prayer is so God can feel good about himself, right? To have a number of us pray. If on this specific day God were feeling just a little bit fat, well, all these prayers are going to make him feel better. And you got all these people recognizing him. That's not the point. No, some of these expressions of religion, of theology, of worship, they're for our benefit as opposed to God. Job chapter 35. Job 35, and in verse 6 here we find Elihu criticizing Job's thinking. Throughout the whole book, Job's thinking was kind of funky. And on the surface, it may not seem clear what some of the missteps of Job were, but Elihu breaks down a lot of the false ways of reasoning that Job had. And here's one of them. In Job 35, verse 6, Elihu says, if you sin, how does that affect him? How does that affect God? If you sin, how does that affect God? Even if you sin again and again, what effect will it have on him? If you are good, is this some great gift to him? What could you possibly give him? No, your sins affect only people like yourself, and your good deeds only affect humans. You're not making God have a bad day because you don't act right. Now, don't get me wrong. God does care. God does have vested interest in our behavior and us behaving right. He does care, but are you making it so that now God is going to have his life shortened because we don't act right? No, it's the other way around. John chapter 12, this expression that of worship and any attempts to bolster that expression of worship, bolster our faith, it's to our benefit as opposed to making God healthy, making God well, or God operate better. John chapter 12 and in verse 23, here we have a point in time where Christ is talking. And in the middle of his talking, there is an expression from heaven, verbal expression. Christ begins to speak, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. He begins to detail what he means. Verse 27, now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. No, it was for this very reason I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Christ is expressing and talking about how he feels and what he's about to go through and looking forward to what he's going to have to encounter. And after he's finished saying this, then a voice came from heaven. I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again. The crowd that was there and heard it had said that was thunder. Others said an angel had spoken. In Christ's response, this voice was for your benefit, not mine. Christ is going, don't get it twisted. That wasn't for me. You probably hear stuff like that all the time. Can you imagine? Anybody else would think they were going crazy, but this bridge between the physical human world and the spirit world wasn't foreign to him. And so he tells the people, that voice you heard was for you. You think that made him feel any differently than he'd been feeling the last 30-something years? That it made his behavior any more clearer? Not at all. And so we do see how these expressions and these tools that have been given to us, whether it's an experience, a voice, or a building to congregate at, is for our benefit as opposed to God's benefit. And so, now back to the temple. We've already kind of clarified it's a place of worship. It's a place of prayer, and it's for our benefit. And so when we think of the temple, we automatically equate it with church, because that's how we live in our world. We go to church, and we have to struggle with this idea that church is a people, is an ecclesia. But usually we just default to the building. And so we swap out the word temple for church. And when we look at the Bible and we see X, Y, and Z goes to temple, well, X, Y, and Z went to church. We swap it out. That's how we get down. And when we look at the Bible, we see people going to temple, and we picture people sitting in a temple, listening to sermons, maybe listening to songs in the temple. And I want you to know, that's not how that works. That's not how that happened. That's not how that worked at all. Because when you look at the temple, hey, Mr. Engineer, that's a beautiful logo. What happened to the picture of the temple? All right, Mr. Engineer. Mr. Engineer, it's just us today. So no one else is hearing all of this going on. You look at the temple, and you see a big structure. I'm like, what's all of this? And what we have is the temple complex. And we may equate it with a large arena. And oftentimes, if you go see a show, go to Madison Square Garden. Pick any artist of your choice. I don't know, who you think could sell out Madison Square Garden and actually fill the building?
Richard.
Who?
Richard.
Richard? You speak of yourself. Okay. I'm sure you got to get the word out first. I'm not familiar with a lot of artists that the room may be familiar with, so I'm going to pick one. It may be old, so I don't know how appropriate it could be. Buju Banton. Can he sell out Madison Square Garden? He might be able to fill that building, and it's going to have to be with people coming from Jersey and New York. But, you know, some of these larger artists in terms of American artists or any other artist with crossover appeal. Maybe back in his day, he could have. But, you know, Madison Square Garden is a very large complex and with a lot of different entrances and sections to the building. And that's what we have here essentially. And so you see this wall with a perimeter around a structure in between. That structure in between is filled with space. Guys, why is everybody staring at the like y'all can't hear me? Everyone in the room can hear me, but for people on Zoom. So we see this structure here, and I don't know, Mark, if people on Zoom can see this, but everybody in the room, you guys wasted good trees. Trees as in paper. So y'all can see the same thing. And you see this wall surrounding, encompassing a courtyard or a plaza with a lot of space in between. And that space is composed of a number of courtyards. There's sections and there are areas to it. And you see in the middle another structure composed of other courtyards, but in the very center is the sanctuary, the temple building. That sanctuary, that temple building, is where God would dwell. And so if any of you were to look at the screen, if any of you were to look at the handouts that I gave out, and you could see that there are designations on, and what you have is inside these walls, you have in this plaza courtyards. Like if you were to go to the mall, if you go to the mall and you're going shopping, if you were to say, I'm going to the mall, but really you're going to Macy's, does that make you a liar? You're going to Macy's, you're going to Target, you're going to Best Buy, you're going to the mall. It's one and the same. When you go to the mall, you're going to Macy's. That doesn't necessarily mean, because you go to the mall, that you're specifically going to Macy's or Target or Best Buy. The mall has so much more going on. And there are different sections to the mall. There's a food court. And it's usually filled on the weekends with young people. You're not going to see people 60 and up, throngs of people 60 and up chilling at the food court, eating the Chinese food and the pizza and the burgers. They're not doing it. And the same way, just like the mall has certain people that seem to congregate in specific areas, so this temple complex would work out the same way. The elderly, the older people, they seem to hang out in the areas where there's seats where they could sit down. And then you have other sections of the mall where Santa Claus would be, or the Easter Bunny, and people come take pictures. And likewise, here in this temple complex, you have different courtyards. And you have a courtyard for the Gentiles, non-Jews, where any Israelite Jewish male, any Jewish woman, and any non-Jew could congregate in this area, in the courtyard for the Gentiles. This area right here, and this area out here, it's just the perimeter inside these walls. But then, so you have this temple complex, and you have an area where the Gentiles can go. And then you get a little bit smaller, and you have an area where the women can go. The Jewish women and the Jewish men, limited to them. And then you get a little bit smaller, you have an area where only the Jewish men could go. And you get a little bit smaller, and you have an area where only the priests could go. So you have the Gentiles, court of the Gentiles, for the Jewish men, the Jewish women, and the Jewish Gentiles, everybody could go there. A little bit smaller, you have an area where only the Jewish men and the Jewish women could go, court of the women. And you get a little bit smaller, an area where only the Jewish men can go. And that's what we have here. And even smaller than that, an area where only the priests could go. And in that area where the altars would be, where they would offer sacrifices and the animals, and have access to the sanctuary where they could go into the temple, the actual building. And only the priest could go in there, but only the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies. So I've repeated that a number of times. Getting back to what I'm saying, when we see people going to the temple, we swap it out with the word church. And we are thinking people go in and they sit down in the building and they listen to sermons and so on and so forth. That's not happening, because the common man, the common woman, can't go into that building, the actual sanctuary where God would dwell. Only the priest could even go into that court. They didn't go in the building. They didn't go sit down. When we swap out the building for church, the way we sit in church and listen to the minister talk, the Jews didn't do that. They did not go in that building. They didn't go in that section. They didn't pass this area right here. But when you look at your picture, where you see the digits 2 and 3, they didn't go past that wall. And that's one of the misconceptions that we may have. Now, there's a distinction between how we may see church and how the Jews recognize the temple, and how we would look at when they went to synagogue, completely something else. But before I start to move on, recognize this. When we see the word temple in the Bible and people going to temple, it's not referring just to the sanctuary, just to that building in the center. When you say you're going to the mall, it's not just referring to Macy's. It's not just referring to Best Buy. It's referring to that whole complex. So when somebody went to the temple, they went to that whole complex. That's where they went to worship. You prayed, you had your gatherings, you listened to people speaking in either the court of the Gentiles, in either the court of the women, the court of the men. They didn't go sit inside the building and kick back and listen to what had to be said. The building was not hosting visitors like that, just God and his servants. And so I mentioned the synagogue. There's a distinction. You will have people go inside a synagogue, sit down, and listen to a speaker. We'd probably be better off swapping synagogue out for church as opposed to temple, which meant the whole plaza, the whole complex, not just the building. And even if we did, we'd still be wrong. Because the way that the Jews kept synagogue, kept their service, completely off from what we're thinking as well. And so we saw the word for church is ecclesia, refers to the people, not the building. The word for synagogue is bet kinset. Kinsetti? Anybody know how to pronounce this? Synagogue. Bet kinset. I don't know. No, it isn't. No, not at all. Anyway, the word for synagogue in Hebrew, it means house of gathering. There again, not really referring to the building. And when we look at the synagogue in the first century, it was more like a community center. And so we'll see scriptures like one we're going to turn to, Luke 4. I'll turn there in a moment, where Christ, like was his custom, he went to synagogue on the Sabbath. But that's on Saturday, where they held service. During the week, they may have had, if there were any court issues or legal issues, it would take place at the synagogue of the community. If there was Bible study, children's school, if there was an engagement, it would happen at the synagogue. It was really akin to a community center. And that's how that would function during the week. And so, how would their service go? It wasn't like this. No, it was more circular. And even when you look at how people ate, you look at the picture of the Last Supper, and you see a whole bunch of effeminate dudes with marvelous hair, and they're sitting at the table in a line. That's not how they would eat. They would eat more in a circle, and they wouldn't sit at a table the way we sit. They would lay on cushions and reach over and take bread, and that's how they did. That picture is not accurate.
It's called Beit Knesset.
Beit Knesset?
Beit.
Ah.
Bait, like the bait, fish bait.
Right.
Knesset.
Beit Knesset. This is the proper pronunciation of Hebrew in the synagogue, and it means house of gathering, more so emphasizing the people as opposed to the building. And so describing a synagogue, when they would meet, it was more in a circular fashion. And so you would have men. I'm unclear as to whether the men and the women mixed. Some sources say in the first century they did, other sources say they didn't. And if they didn't, the women might be on a balcony or side portion of where the men are. So picture now, you got like a U shape with people sitting in a U shape. And they're not even sitting in chairs. They would have stone carved out. And we would see these stone seats or pillars of seats more so at the park. And for us personally, there was a park that we were meeting at, Jackie Robinson Park. I think that park had stone seats like that somewhere. And you would sit on the seat. That's the way it would be at the synagogue, but in a circle or a U-shaped. And so the speaker would be invited to read scripture initially, and then they would go into the center of that circle and read scripture. And after they read, they would turn around and go sit kind of at the center of the horseshoe. And that was called Moses' seat. And it's from that position, they would then expound on what they just read. And that's, quote unquote, if you want to call it that, their sermon. That's how they had their synagogue. And that's what we see happening in Luke chapter 4, verse 16. And so we'll turn there, take a glance at how things went down in the synagogue, just for clarification and comparison, and then we'll return back to looking at the temple. Luke chapter 4, verse 16. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. The scrolls, they didn't have a Bible. All the books would be on a separate scroll. They would probably be kept in a separate room off to the side, either on shelves or in jars. Not glass jars like spaghetti, big pottery jars with a lid. So the attendant would take out the scroll and bring it to the reader. In this case, it's Christ. And so now he goes to the center of the room, he opens up the scroll and he's reading. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written. And Christ begins to read Isaiah chapter 61, verse 1. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind. And without skipping a beat, he moves from Isaiah 61, verse 1, over to Isaiah 58, verse 6. And he doesn't even read all of Isaiah 58, verse 6. He reads 3/4 of the way into the verse, and he says, and recovery of sight for the blind. And then he jumps back to Isaiah 61, verse 2, and keeps reading. The people in the circle are sitting there watching him going, what is he doing? Why would he skip around like that? Everyone knows these scriptures, by the way. And so he now goes back to Isaiah 61, verse 2, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. He reads the beginning of Isaiah 61, verse 2, and stops, and goes and sits back down in Moses' seat, center of the horseshoe, and this circle. People would have expected, nobody does that, reads a prophecy, reads half of it, and just stops. And so, verse 20, then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him because of what he just did and the way that he did it. He began to say to them, today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. And he begins to speak. And that's the sermon. If you're interested, you can continue to read what happens. It goes totally south. He loses the room. He begins to talk about them and basically kind of insults them. And they was like, oh, that's it. And now they pick him up and they drag him out to throw him off a cliff. Their intent was to throw him off a cliff. It is not a cliff the way we would think a cliff. Like we think of a big mountain, they're going to throw him off a mountain. No, it was more of an embankment. This was legal in their religion, in their law, to be thrown off a cliff or some sort of embankment. It had to be a minimum height of 2 men. That's how high it was. Their intent, they would tie your hands behind your back and throw you over head first. Head first, you hit the ground. If you don't die, then they stone you to kill you. But God miraculously just slipped out from them and they lost track of him. But we see how we look at church is really a people, not a building. How we look at synagogue, really a people, not a building. And we see how it differs from how we would see church service going. That's not how they did when they had their synagogue. And now going back to the temple, we see in this temple, that's also not how they did. So they're not going inside the building, the actual temple. So what are they doing? They held their sessions in these courts in various areas. And we could start to see some of the experiences that they may have had by looking at certain points in the Bible and see what they did when they went to the temple. And so we'll start to go through that and look at certain scriptures. One, people go to the temple. Before you even walk in, you had to take a ceremonial bath. I made mention of this before with how the Jews were into these ceremonial rituals of cleaning, and they would wash their hands by keeping large jars made of stone with water in it. That water was considered pure because it was stone and not pottery. It was living water. And they would use those jars to wash their hands. The Jews, the religious leaders, would take exception to what Christ's disciples would do because they weren't washing their hands. Yeah, I'll get to that. I'm talking about the washing of the hands ritual. Yes, I'm not talking about the ceremonial bath yet. So the ceremonial washing of the hands was done not out of cleanliness. It was meant to be ceremonially, ritually pure. You're cool with God, you're good with God, you're right with God spiritually if you wash your hands. Because you washed your hands, you're now pure. And certainly pure to do a lot of these rituals, but that's how they saw it. It had nothing to do with your inner person being a good, righteous person. And that's why Christ would say, stop acting stupid. What you eat is cleansed by your body's digestive system. And washing your hands has nothing to do with making you right with God in and of itself. And so he had that attack. But that's how the Jews saw things. So an extinction of that is, or would be, these ceremonial baths. And so they would wash themselves, submerge themselves in water before they entered the temple. And they would enter this large basin made of stone filled with water called a mikvah. And they would get in their mikvah and dunk themselves and then come out. And now they're ceremonially clean, they're ceremonially pure. They can enter the temple. I've also made mention in the past that when you see John the Baptist and Christ baptizing, it wasn't completely foreign to the people. They didn't make it up. John the Baptist did not invent baptism and dunking people in water. This was something that was done. It was something that the people were familiar with to begin with. And so after they dunked themselves in this water, they were now able to enter the temple. Now keep in mind, there would be a number of these mikvahs located throughout Judea and in immediate access to the temple complex or the temple. When a person says temple, when I say temple, I mean this whole complex, and that's what they meant. They didn't just mean the building in the center, the sanctuary. And so these mikvahs would be located at around the various gates of the entrance to the plaza of the temple. When I say temple, I do not mean the building in the center. The regular guy, the regular girl can't go anywhere near that building. So when people went to the temple to pray, to listen to preaching, they weren't inside that building. All right. So they would go to the mikvah, dunk themselves, men, women, anybody, and you had to do this as required. And then they would go to one of the gates. Now, first example, I'll turn to John chapter 5 and verse 1. And we see people going to the temple. And what do I mean by temple? This whole plaza. John chapter 5, verse 1. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now, there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which is in Aramaic, is called Bethesda. And so I'm about to get into a story about a guy that's lame and he's by a pool. I want to clarify. The scholars debate whether this was actually a mikveh or not. It may have just been a regular pool. Maybe it was a mikveh where people had to dunk themselves to make themselves ritually pure. They don't know. They're not sure. And some will argue for reasons of that being the case or not. But here we see, this is near the temple. I don't know if it was a mikveh or not, but it's near the sheep gate, or one of these gates that are around the building. And the sheep gate would have been one of the gates where they would bring the sheep in for sacrifice or to be sold by the vendors in the temple. And you know the story, if you go through it, Christ is approaching to enter one of these gates to go into the temple. And what do I mean by temple? This whole plaza. He's not going in the building in the center. That sounds sacrilegious, doesn't it? Christ couldn't go into the court of the priest. He wasn't a priest. And so as a man, he didn't go there. But he went into the temple into all these other courts, court of the Gentiles, court of the women, court of the men. But he didn't go into the court of the priests. Even though, to be quite honest, probably wouldn't have been in his full right to do so. Would have caused an uproar. Or you get killed if you go past the point you're not supposed to. And they have big signs, do not enter past this point, especially for the Gentiles. Else you would get killed. Anyway, so speaking of this pool of here in verse 3, here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there and had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" And he replied, "Sir, I have no one to help me get into the pool when the water is stirred." They had this belief an angel would come down, stick his hand in the pool, and if that happened, if you jumped in the pool, whoever jumped in the pool first would get healed of whatever infirmities they had. And so Christ was like, you ain't got to worry about trying to be the first to jump in the pool. And he healed him and told him he was healed to get up and walk, take his mat, and go about his business. And in so doing, when the man did that, he wound up having a number of problems with the religious authorities. But nevertheless, the point I'm trying to make, they're in the vicinity of the temple. And what do I mean by temple? This whole complex, not just the building in the middle. I mean, they're by one of the gates. And Christ is about to walk into the temple, into the complex, into the mall. He's going into the mall, and he's not even going to Macy's. He's not going to Forever 21. Do any of you still go to Forever 21? All right. I can't go in. Do they sell clothes for men? They don't? All right. It wouldn't fit me no how. I couldn't. Segue of how things have changed. I went into Old Navy to buy some pants. It's been years. Look at that. See? Someone asked me, they still exist. They still exist, yes. No, they're still around. I went in Old Navy to buy some pants. I haven't been in there in years. I am now, for all intents and purposes, I'm 53. And in my 20s, I'd go in there and I'd buy pants. I went in there and I had to find an attendant. I was like, listen, and I'm not really fat. But I'm like, where are the larger sizes? Like, we don't have larger sizes. I mean, after about 30, 35, 36, nothing. I couldn't find pants to fit me in there. I was like, wow, I'm too old for Old Navy. Wow. I had to leave with my head down. Getting back to the temple. There's another gate. So that was the Sheep's Gate. Let's look at the Golden Gate. And also, there's an area by the Golden Gate called Solomon's Porch. And we could see this in Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 2 and in verse 45. Luke 2. In verse 45. Here's the instance where the parents of Christ, Joseph and Mary, lost Jesus. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, not in the temple. When you hear the story, sometimes you would imagine 11-year-old Christ sitting inside a building, talking with the priest, talking in the temple. Not at all. None of these guys can go into the temple, the court of the priest. They can't go into the court of the priest, and they can't go into the temple sanctuary itself. This was happening in the temple courts, in one of these areas out here surrounding it. That's where people would gather. It's happening in one of these areas out here surrounding the temple building itself. And that's where people would gather to have meetings, to speak, to learn. And that's where they found 11-year-old Christ. That's where they found teenage Jesus. He's talking with the teachers of the law. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, Why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you. Christ's response, why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house? Not the building in the center of the complex. This complex, this plaza, was God's house. The whole plaza, not just the building in the middle. And so Christ was like, I'm home. And he's not even in the center. He's in one of the courts. And he was home. He was in his father's house in one of the courts. And that's what the Jews did. That's what people did when they went to worship. They weren't inside in that building. Now, they're not always exposed to the air. When you look at the perimeter, these are pillars. We might call it a patio, gazebo. There's some other words that you could use for it. And these pillars have a roof above them. And so you could be inside under the pillars. There were also rooms in these corridors and in other sections of the courts, the court of the women and some of the other courts had rooms that people might rent, rooms for storage, rooms to keep wood, rooms to keep wine, rooms to keep supplies, rooms for people to come, the lepers to come to be blessed, rooms for the Nazarites to come, the Samson type dudes that let their hair grow, and they would come and give an offering and make a worship. And from what I understand, they would cut a snippet of their hair and burn it. They would never cut their hair at any other time. And so there were rooms that people could utilize, rooms for the priest, rooms for the staff of the temple to sleep and rest. There were other functions and rooms there where the priests that maybe they weren't clean that day. They got the clean up nasty duty, and they would get put in the room for the wood that would come to the temple, and they would have to clean the worms out the wood that would be used in the service of the temple. Another example of the temple in Matthew chapter 4 and in verse 5. Matthew 4, verse 5. Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. Other translations will say he had him stand on a pinnacle. And he says to him, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. And he begins to quote scripture. So, what's happening here? This word pinnacle, sometimes we may think this pinnacle is like a pointy steeple, and on that point, they were standing. How are they standing on this little teeny point? I don't know. They got skills. Their spirit, they can fly, and they're just standing there. That's not what's happening. A pinnacle was the highest point of a building, and it was a platform. And the pinnacle at the temple was the highest point of the temple, but it was a platform where you would stand. The Jews, or the temple priests would come out and blow horns at various points in the day to let the people know that gathered way down there on the ground, it's time to pray, it's time for certain sacrifices, it's time to commemorate something. There's some sense of recognize this by blowing their horns. And they'd come out on the pinnacle, on this platform, on what we would call a roof, blow their horns, and then they go back inside. Satan took Christ on this pinnacle. We think of pinnacle as a steeple. And even that comes from idolatry. When you look at the Old Testament, and God is often referring to the groves or places where people would do idol worship and call it the high places. He's calling it the high places because they would have these trademarks, these insignias to let people know, you want to come worship Baal? Come here, and you would see a steeple. You would see this point. And you see that on churches. People are so stupid. The churches now have these steeples not realizing straight out of paganism. And then you have the miniature steeples, where instead of just taking the whole arch of a building or that pointy part of the church, you just break off the pointy part. That's a mini steeple, or you would call it a magic wand. And so you have Harry Potter with his magic wand, his steeple, directly connected to Baal and the high places and the groves that people would go worship. It's not just Harry Potter. It's the fairy godmother in Cinderella. Bippity Bobbity Boo, thank you. I don't remember the whole song. Should I test it out? I don't think you guys even know. I know you know, but I don't think they know. Stop it, Mr. Anderson. Mr. Anderson, you know the song? The Bippity Boppity Boop? How does it go? No, don't help him. And so, Satan takes Christ to the pinnacle. Not a pinnacle the way we think. He took him to the roof of the temple. Another part of the temple, the highest point. And they say that could be like 15 stories high. That's very high. It's very high. And he's telling him to jump off. Would you have fallen for that, by the way? Yeah, go on, just jump. Ain't nothing gonna happen. Satan was trying to get Christ to think in a more selfish, self-centered way. It was a misdirect. He was trying to trick him, but Christ didn't fall for it and saw through it and knew the proper way to think and approach God and the scriptures. Now we start to move our way into the court of the Gentiles after leaving some of these gates. Matthew chapter 21 and in verse 12. Matthew 21 and in verse 12. Jesus entered the temple courts. Here we go again. Christ is now entering the temple courts. He's not going into the center of the building. Right here. He's not going into the sanctuary. He's going into the courts from one of these gates in the perimeter. He's walking into the plaza. When anytime we say temple, it means the whole plaza, not the building in the middle. And so now he's in the court of the Gentiles. Once he walks in, he's out here. That's if he went through a gate. There were some other gates where when you went through the gate, you walked through a tunnel. And then you came out the tunnel. You came out the tunnel and you came out from underground right here. These two entrances, if you could look on your paper, which nobody's using. Forget you guys, making you guys copies. You know how much time that took out of my life? About 5 or 10 minutes. That's why I was late. And I could have been on time and I wouldn't have to make any copy. Everybody on Zoom. Do we still have the Zoom online? Yeah. I'm sorry, guys on Zoom. Sometimes you got to let them know. But these two things right here, these were coming from underground. Depending if you came into a gate way out here. And a lot of times, some of the entrances, you have to come across a very large bridge. When they talk about the temple, from all that I'm seeing, it was really a beautiful building. And there's no way to tell. Even the scholars, they don't know what it looked like. They could guess. They could use some of the religious writings and writings from Josephus, who has a really good track record of describing what things were like in the first century. So, now Matthew 21, verse 12. Jesus entered the temple courts, that whole area, and he's going to the court of the Gentiles, and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, because they were selling there in the temple courts. What's the big deal? Ain't nothing wrong with buying some needed necessities, especially if you're going to use it for the church. Well, there's a whole backstory behind that. And I'll start to tell it. Once upon a time, there was a man named Annas. Annas was the high priest. Annas became high priest in AD 6, I believe. Annas was a Sadducee and a very influential, powerful, wealthy, corrupt man. He was a crime boss. And I mean that. And he was the high priest. And he was the high priest for about 10 years. Until he got in trouble. He got in trouble with Rome. He had a person that violated the Sabbath. He had them stoned. You can't do that. as you read through the Bible and you see how they're trying to crucify Christ, they're trying so hard because they are unallowed to engage in capital punishment per agreement with Rome. Rome says, we won't bother you and let you live your life if you just keep some of these laws. And that was one of them. Can't perform capital punishment. Can't have somebody killed. The Romans could, which is why they were going through all this trouble to have Christ convicted by Rome so they could kill him, because they couldn't. Unless he blasphemed, and they couldn't get him to do that. Here you have, under Annas, who is now the high priest in this period of time, has a person that violated the Sabbath stone. And Rome is like, what are you doing? We told you you can't do that. So he got fired. In his place, and in fact, the next 5 high priests were all from his family. 5 of his sons became high priest, and his son-in-law, Caiaphas, who's the one that sentenced Christ. And so people still looked at Annas, though, as the high priest. They still respected him. They still felt that he had that true lineage of going back to David as being one of the priests, which is why when you see Christ arrested, they go to Annas first, and then they go to Caiaphas, where he's sentenced, and the workers slap Christ and so forth, and John or James, I don't remember, I think John snuck in. He didn't sneak in, he was let in, because John knew the high priest family. They were affluent like that themselves. Peter snuck in. Nevertheless, this is who Annas was. And so the next 5 of his children became high priests, and it was a family thing. They controlled the wealth, controlled the power. I told you he was a crime boss. And the family was a family of organized crime. And it was well known by the people in Judea how this family operated. In fact, Annas and his 5 sons were the big bads of the area. Some scholars feel the parable of Lazarus was a dig at Annas and his 5 sons, because you see one of the priests, one of the powerful men, wants to warn his brothers, the other 5. And some feel that Christ was taking a dig at Annas' family specifically because they were corrupt. And they ran things in Judea. Annas owned a number of businesses, and one of them were the businesses that would sell animals to people for sacrifice. And they were at different locations in Judea. There was one on the Mount of Olives. There was one at the base of the mountain, or the trail that leads up to the temple in the Kindred Valley. There are a number of them. And these tables were called the tables of Annas, because he ran things and it was his family selling it. And they would sell animals at exorbitant prices, 4 times as much as the going rate, which really hurt the poor. And the poor, they're not going to buy a whole cow. They're not going to buy a whole goat. They're going to buy something cheap. They would buy the doves. You're supposed to buy a dove for $1.50. He's selling doves for $25, $30. What are you doing? They can't afford that. The very thing that the only thing that can buy the doves, he's overpricing. And so he's overpricing. And now it got to a point where they say about 30 AD or so, right, when Christ comes on the scene, they moved one of those tables into the court of the Gentiles. And not only did he move the tables to sell animals into the court of the Gentiles, they moved a number of other things into the court. And so now the court of the Gentiles has become a bazaar. Now it's a place to sell things. So you have these tables that are selling animals that he owns at high prices that the poor can afford. The animals are coming from his stock. He was the Amazon of his day. His own animals. He's fueling this, coming from his supply, and he's making money. The people selling it got to pay him a fee for what they're selling, so he gets money from that. There were other people selling other stuff. There were banks there to change your money. They would change your money from the Roman coins with Caesar's image on it, which would be considered unclean, to the shekel. And the shekel was from the city of Tyre. They wanted the shekel as the main course of money because it had the most concentration of silver in it. The same way people do business, they want to use the American dollar, they want to use the euro, they want to use the yen, whatever's highest at that point. The shekel was the highest form of currency. So they used the shekel. And when you did business, if you wanted to change your money to get the shekel, there was a fee to change your money, a high fee that went to him, that went to Annas and his family. You wanted to do business with the banks gave loans, and they're doing this business here in the temple. Remember, temple means the whole complex, not just the building in the middle. They're doing it in the court of the Gentiles. And so you could get a loan from these banks here in the temple. And the loans would be, the interest rates were really high on purpose because they were meant to hurt the poor and steal the land of the poor, the homes of the poor, the homes of the widows. And so people would lose their homes because of the corrupt practices of Annas and his family taking place here at the temple. Even the whole way of doing things with the temple procedures was corrupt. The priest, Annas had the priest corrupt. Annas was at one point the high priest, and if it wasn't him, it was one of his sons or his son-in-law Caiaphas. He's still running things through them. And so you have certain priests that are on duty. But then you have a number of other priests that are serving, and they're serving on rotation. So you have a number of priests that don't live at the temple complex. They live out and about in the land. They live far away. Maybe they have other jobs. They're farmers. They're, what do you call the dude that makes the shoes for the horses? Blacksmiths, things like that. They have other jobs. 2 weeks out the year, they were assigned to come to the temple, and it would rotate because there were so many priests. And so they come to the temple. They don't live there. They come from far away. It costs a bit of money. And they come, they work here for 2 weeks, they go home. They would get a stipend. People would come and give sacrifices. Now, mind you, when people gave sacrifices, various people in the chain of how that animal moved along would eat from that meat. The priest and even the person themselves would eat the meat that was offered. It was like, in some sense, like a barbecue. But that is not a wholly accurate comparison to what they were doing with the sacrifices. But there were components of it that certainly were. And so the priests were supposed to get some of that food. They were supposed to get some of the money, some of the grain, some of the oils. They were supposed to get the skin of some of the animals, very valuable. And that was theirs. And they would take that home. They would get a bit of money. Not under Annas. Under Annas, you had to give a kickback. You got to give some of that back. And it's like, but it's mine. I'm supposed to get it. I'm the priest. And if you didn't give it back, and his goons would beat you up and steal it. A lot of priests would get jumped, get mugged on the way out, going home, and have all their payment taken. This is what was going on under Annas and his family. They were corrupt. They were so corrupt, the Essenes, the group of men that were very religious, that were responsible for the Qumran document scrolls, the Qumran scrolls that were found in the 70s or the late 60s. They were like, we're not messing with the temple anymore. And they totally withdrew because the temple, they said, was corrupt. When you see Christ constantly taking digs at the religious authorities, it's because of that. He knew it. He saw it. They all lived it. And he constantly criticized them. And that's why he overturned the tables. In short, because there were some prophetic reasons for why he did that. Some believe he did it twice at the beginning of his ministry when he arrived at his temple and right before he left. But certainly the corruption was a part of it. And it wasn't like, oh, you guys are selling, you shouldn't be doing it. It was way more than that. It was bad. And so Christ's response, it is written, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers. Because that's what they were, and that's what they were doing, robbing. They were no good. Acts chapter 3, we see another example of how the temple operated. Acts chapter 3 and verse 1. Acts 3, verse 1. One day, now this is after Christ arose, was resurrected, went back to the Father, and now the apostles, they're not disciples now, they're apostles, now they're the ones preaching, they're the ones working their magic, they're the ones bringing this gospel. One day, Peter and John were going up to the temple, the whole temple complex, not just the building in the middle. They're going up to the temple at the time of prayer. And so what do you have? You probably have the priests come out on the pinnacle and blowing the horns. The roof, the highest point of the temple. You know, when you would approach the temple, you would hear music because the priests would play music from their section. And so you would just hear that ensemble. It was a very lively area. It's not like just a couple of dudes walking through. It was crowded. And mind you, when Christ overthrew those tables, the reason why things definitely kicked up, I told you these guys were mafia. Christ overturned their tables, the busiest time of the year. You have nearly 1 million people there. You know how much money you can make from 1 million people? And when you read and combine the other Gospels, you see that for the next 3 days while Christ was in there preaching in the temple courts, he wasn't letting anybody come through with any merchandise. 3 days, no business. Annas and the rest of the family was like, oh no, you gotta go now. He messed with the man's money, his income coming in, and just cut it short. You ever see those TV shows where the drugs get interrupted? You just took all, blocks of heroin off the market. Oh, you gotta die. So that was very disruptive. But I'm trying to make the point that the whole area and the temple complex was very lively and full of a lot of energy. Acts chapter 3, verse 1. One day Peter and John were going up to the temple complex, the temple plaza, at the time of prayer, at 3 p.m. Now a man who was lame from birth was being carried to the temple gate, called Beautiful. So one of these gates is called Beautiful, and that's where this man was being laid. And as people went through, he would beg for money. They say this temple gate was just encased and made of bronze and was very beautiful, and that's why it was called that. When he saw Peter and John about to enter, he asked them for money. Peter looked straight at him, as did John. Then Peter said, "Look at us." So the man gave them his attention, expecting to get something from them. Then Peter said, "Silver or gold I do not have, but what I do have I give you. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, walk." Taking him by the right hand, he helped him up, and instantly the man's feet and ankles became strong. He jumped to his feet and began to walk. Then he went with them into the temple courts. So now he's in this area, walking and jumping and praising God. When all the people saw him walking and praising God, they recognized him as the same man who used to sit begging at the temple gate called Beautiful. This isn't happening inside the building. It's happening in the courts of the Gentiles. While the man held on to Peter and John, all the people were astonished and came running to them in the place called Solomon's Colonnade. I may have made mention to that area as well. It was close to the women's courts, or maybe I didn't mention it. But it was one of the sections in here, and I'm sure it's on the diagram somewhere. It's called Solomon's Porch. Maybe it's not here, but if you look in other areas, in other pictures, you would see that designated. Oh, it's called Solomon's Pacifico or something like that. That's the same thing, that area. That's where this is taking place. And so what happens? When Peter saw this, he said to them, "Fellow Israelites, why does this surprise you?" And he begins to preach. So now he's preaching and he's teaching in the courts, in this area. They're not inside the temple, they're not sitting down, but he's bringing church to them right there in the courts. And that's how they they interacted. That's how they did things. Jumping over to to Acts chapter 4, verse 1. The priest and the captain of the temple guard and the Sadducees came up to Peter and John while they were speaking to the people. They were greatly disturbed because the apostles were teaching the people, proclaiming in Jesus the resurrection of the dead. They seized Peter and John, and because it was evening, they put them in jail. So they went and grabbed them up as they're preaching and teaching right there in the courts. But many who heard the message believed, so the number of men who believed grew to about 5,000. He's standing there preaching in this area, and he got 5,000 hits. I said, he's standing there preaching. Hey, I lost the mic. Mr. Engineer, why did you do that? What are you trying to say? What are you trying to say, Mr. Engineer? All right. So he's standing there preaching, and he got 5,000 converts. How many people we got on Zoom today, Mr. Engineer? How many people we got on Zoom? 6. Don't get me wrong, guys, on Zoom. We love to have you. Thank you for coming. If we had our Wi-Fi going, maybe we would have had a little bit more. I repeat, Peter and John were standing there preaching in the courts, not inside the temple, in the courts. They were holding church. 5,000 converts. How you do that? That goes to show you how many people are coming through and moving about and listening and coming to worship in the courts, at the temple. And that's what they would call it. They're at the temple. They're not inside, but this is what they called the temple, even though we may not have perceived it to be that. And so Peter and John are taken to jail. They were miraculously released, I think, if you go through the story, by the hand of God somehow. And what do they do when they get back out? They go right back to the courts and start preaching. And turning over to Acts chapter 5. Before I get to Acts chapter 5, look at verse 12. The apostles performed many signs and wonders among the people, and all the believers used to meet together in Solomon's colonnade. And this is where they would go. They would come to this area in the court, and this is where they would gather, and they would have church. This was how they worshiped. And this is what they called going to the temple, but this is how they're doing it, and this is where they're doing it. Dropping down to 42. Day after day in the temple courts, and from house to house, they never stopped teaching and proclaiming the good news that Jesus is the Messiah. And so we see how this is where they went. This is how they kept service. This is how they did church. Here in the temple courts and not inside the building. And that's how they worshiped. Acts chapter 2 and verse 40. Acts chapter 2 and in verse 40. With many other words he warned them. This is Peter again. And he pleaded with them. Save yourselves from this corrupt generation. He's preaching. Those who accepted his message were baptized. This is another incident, by the way. And about 3,000 were added to their number. And he's preaching in the courts in this area. And he pulls 3,000. This is how many people are listening, how many people are aware, and how many people are responsive. Mark chapter 12, verse 41. Mark 12, verse 41. We see another incident, and this time in the temple, in the court of the women. Mark 12, verse 41. Here we find Christ sitting in the court of the women and just observing. Mark 12 and verse 41. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. So Christ is now in a separate part. He's in the court of the women. The court of the women, from my understanding, I believe the court of the women would be in here. So you have the court of the women, where only the men, the Jewish men and the Jewish women would be, where you would gather for teaching and understanding and so forth. And Christ is sitting there just watching and observing, and people are coming in and they're putting money in the donation box. In the court of the women, there were two donation boxes called the boxes of the poor, and they were donations for the poor. The box didn't look like a donation box like ours would look like, just be a box with a slit. It looked like a horn attached to a box. So the opening that a horn would have, but more so like the shofar would look, that wide opening, and it would get narrowed into the box so nobody could come, stick their hand in and take the money out. Anyway, he's sitting and he's watching people come, make donations into the boxes of the poor, or the donation boxes for the poor, which were kept in the court of the women. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd, putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. And he's sitting there and he sees this, calling his disciples to him, who are also there in this area, and it's probably crowded. Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on. And so we can see how observant Christ is to society around him, the world around him, and how full of life the temple actually was. And it's not just a building, it's this whole plaza. But we do understand the true temple is us. But it's interesting to understand how it operated, how people worshiped. The worship was about each other. It was about interacting with each other rather than God, for the most part. It wasn't for God's benefit. It was horizontal, left and right, each other, dealing with the man and the woman next to me. It wasn't, the emphasis wasn't vertical up to God. It was about how people dealt with each other. When you look at how Paul commands people to worship, it's about focusing on the needs of each other. And by the time of Paul, there was a push to don't focus on the rituals of the temple. Don't even go to the temple. Gather with each other in each other's homes. Be with the believer as opposed to the unbelievers at the temple. Focus on each other and each other's needs. So people will go, well, you're trying to say we got to worship in the house? And that's what Paul was saying, because that's what it was about, dealing with each other, as opposed to going to the temple, this whole plaza, to spend your Sabbath and interact with others that weren't believers in Christ. Let's end in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. 1 Corinthians chapter 3. In verse 16, don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst? Not just in the temple plaza, in this building in the center at the sanctuary. If anyone destroys God's temple, not the physical building that is now laying in ruins, God will destroy that person, for God's temple is sacred. You who hold God's Spirit, who God is focusing on, which is the very reason why he's telling everyone to worship, to pray, to come together and enjoy each other's company and sharpen each other and learn from each other. For God's temple is sacred, and you together are that temple.